سيبك مقاعة، احنا كلنا AUC، ناس كلنا خريجين جامعة أمريكية. طيب مش عاملين أي تنظيم لشاشة ولا أي حاجة؟ طب مش ممكن تسأل حد عشان كل الناس اللي واقفة دي بدل ما احنا واقفين كده يا نمشي؟ يعني اسأل حد هل في هيعملوا شاشة ولا حاجة؟ يا إما نمشي. مفيش؟ شكرا. مفيش حاجة يا جماعة، مفيش شاشات ولا قاعة ملأت، مش هيقدر يخرج اللي جوه. هم خارجين عشان يوصل التليفون يا جماعه، عشان هم مش عايزين حد يقف في القاعه بس. ازاي لو قدرنا ننجح حتى في اقتراح السماعات ده مش مشكله. انا ما عنديش مانع اخش اقعد في هنا واسمع. ماشي بس اسمع. بس اسمع. انا ما عنديش مانع. شوف لنا حد من الاداره لو سمحت. ممكن حد من الاداره؟ حد من الاداره بعدين. ايوه موضوع السماعات ده احنا عددنا قليل. اسمع هي تتكلم.
The Pentagon is a very natural funnel for a taxpayer to gouge.
In the United States, it's probably a sixth of the economy is devoted to deceiving and controlling people's minds. These industries developed about a century ago in the freest societies in the world, written in the United States. And there was a reason. Enough freedom had been won, so it was becoming difficult to control people by force. There were parliamentary labor parties. Women were getting the right to vote. Just plenty of freedom. Labor rights were increasing. It was harder to control people by force. Not impossible, but harder. And as it became harder, industries arose to follow David Hume's precepts, to control their opinions, attitudes, beliefs. And the goals of the public relations industry were stated quite openly and frankly in the early days, the 1920s. Let's read the business press. It's necessary to direct people's attitudes towards the insignificant things of life, like fashionable consumption. So then they'll be out of our hair. We'll be able to run the world properly. It's necessary to ensure that what was called the stupid and ignorant public doesn't get involved in the administration of affairs and policy. And of course, this is totally benign. The reason is they really are stupid and ignorant. And if we let them have a voice, things will be in trouble. If we run things, everything will be great, as you can see. But the industries grew and developed precisely where there was freedom. And as there's more freedom, they have to find more sophisticated ways to keep the ignorant and stupid majority out of their affairs. Extremely natural, but it's a fragile system. It can be broken very quickly, and has been done in many ways, from personal relations up till international affairs. I mean, the women's movement in the last 40 years is a very striking example. Things that were considered inconceivable 50 years ago are now the norm. So take my own university again. When I got there in 1955, the students were white, male students, well-dressed, jackets and ties, disciplined, obedient, respectful. Now it's nothing like that, fortunately. It's about half women, third minorities, informal dress, which reflects informal relations. Not deference is mostly gone, a lot of interaction and interchange, a lot of political activism, which there never was before. And that hasn't just happened there, it's happened almost everywhere. I'm sure it's happened here, but no.
It has happened here. This is a very specific question that I'm not sure if it can take a specific answer, but what can the general public do to pressure Israel and the USA to avoid an escalation with Iran in order to prevent another war?
There's a lot that can be done. As I mentioned, there's whatever threat anyone believes Iran poses. I mean, we could debate that, but let's suppose there's some kind of threat. There's a simple way to end it. Move towards a nuclear weapons-free zone. It's got overwhelming international support. Egypt, in fact, has been in the lead of pressing for it in the international arena since 1995. I mentioned a majority of the population in Israel favors it. One thing is blocking it, the U.S. and the Israeli government. The American public has no opinion about it, as far as I know. I've never seen a poll. In fact, nobody even knows that the option exists. I'll repeat what I said before. It happens to be a very live opportunity right at this moment. There is a conference coming up, probably in January, in Helsinki, to carry forward the international effort through the UN to move towards implementing this proposal. If there's enough public pressure, the U.S. will have to go along. There can't be public pressure unless people at least know about it. And the media have been highly effective in making sure that nobody knows about it. Literally, you do a Google search, try it. I don't think you'll find a mention of this in the mainstream media in the United States, probably in Europe either. I haven't checked Europe. Well, okay, as long as that continues, nothing will happen, and we'll move on towards a likely war. But there's a point where public activism and education could make a huge difference. I think if the facts become known, you'll get substantial public support for nobody wants a war. And this is a perfectly sensible proposal. Let's just have a nuclear weapons-free zone. These are spreading throughout the world. Let's have one there. End of problem. Not total, it doesn't end every problem, but it certainly significantly mitigates whatever threat there is. So that's a very clear way to proceed.
Professor Chomsky, thank you. This is the question I'll ask is a version of a question I have here in 4 or 5 different ways, but I think they more or less coincide. In light of the rise of Islamicists as a reactionary movement in the region and the growing confidence of the workers to organize and mid-sized strikes and fight social injustice, how do you see the confrontation given the cultural weight of Islam and the apparent conflict between the ruling elite and the Islamist tycoons? Conflict in quotation marks. It's a version of a question about political Islam that is maybe an unfair question for you, but I think a number of people would like your opinion on it.
Well, I don't think there's any particular reason why political Islam should be opposed to workers' struggles for workers' rights. In fact, it might participate with them. It may not, but if so, that ought to be changed. You could ask the same thing about Christian evangelical groups. Can they be brought into supporting workers' rights? One of the main problem here, I think, is what I mentioned in answer to one of the earlier questions. It just isn't in the consciousness of working people that they can, in fact, take over enterprises, run them themselves, kick out the bosses and managers, make decisions about how the work should be carried out, what should be produced, how it could be produced, and so on. And these are not utopian thoughts. First of all, there are a lot of things like that happening. You'll know more than I do, of course, but I've been told that there are moves in this direction right here in Egypt. There have been several attempts, apparently, in the past few years by working people to take over factories and run them. They've been crushed by force under the dictatorship. Maybe it would be freer now. I know in the United States, it's not huge, but there's an expansion of efforts like this, quite a few. And it could go well beyond. So if consciousness had been high enough, and remember, consciousness is something that can be influenced, right? That takes activism and organization. It's within our power to modify consciousness. If it had been high enough, a couple of years ago when the auto industry collapsed in the United States, it was basically nationalized. Obama took it over, the government owned most of it. Well, there are a number of possibilities as to what to do. One possibility, which is the one that was followed, was to use taxpayer subsidy to restructure it, reconstruct it, hand it over to pretty much the same network of owners, banks, investors, maybe some different names, but fundamentally the same structures, and have it go back to producing exactly what it had been producing, automobiles, so we can have bigger traffic jams. Another possibility would have been to hand the factories over to the workforce and the communities and have them decide what should be done with them. And one of the things that could have been done is to modify them so that instead of producing fossil fuel intensive private transportation, they could produce something that the country very badly needs, high-speed rail. The United States is very deficient in this. They're worse than plenty of third world countries. It's harmful economically, it's harmful humanly, very harmful. You sit in a Cairo traffic jam or a Boston traffic jam, there's huge waste, a waste of human resources, a waste of fuel, it's just a ludicrous way for a society to function. It doesn't have to work this way. These things can be changed. An efficient public transportation system is just enormously beneficial to everyone, and also is a way of dealing with this very serious problem of environmental catastrophe that's facing us. So that could have been done. There was no moves in that direction because it's not part of people's consciousness. It's like asking my grandmother whether she was oppressed. The thought just wasn't in people's minds, but it can be, and these things can happen.
Professor Chomsky, I have another very simple question for you. What is the solution for the Syrian crisis, in your opinion?
That's easy. I don't know of any solution. I don't know of any proposal better than the very low probability suggestions of Lakhdar Brahimi. If there's a better idea, I don't know what it is. It's very unlikely that it's going to work. The forces that are operating seem to be just driving the society towards self-destruction. And it's a horrible thing to watch, but if anybody has a constructive proposal, I haven't heard it. Yeah.
It also has a reputation of having a close relationship to the U.S. Defense Department and the largesse that you described in some detail earlier. So I wonder if you would talk about locating yourself as an intellectual, as a scholar, within a complex intellectual and institutional environment like MIT? I think you have one of your own, actually.
Is this working? Yeah. Well, I joined MIT in 1955. Actually, I was in a lab that was 100% supported by the three armed services. There was a study about 15 years later. The impetus was a student strike about this issue. Good thing to do. They pressed for an analysis, a study of MIT's finances. Actually, I was on the committee that looked into it. The students wanted to have a sympathetic representative. And it was quite interesting. It's 1970, so I may not remember the details precisely, but you can find out. It turned out at that point that about half of MIT's budget was involved two military laboratories, separate military laboratories. The bookkeeping was so crummy, we couldn't figure out whether MIT was gaining or losing from administering these laboratories, but they were off campus. On campus, where I was, about 90% of the funding was coming from the Pentagon. That meant if you were in the music department, you were being funded by the Pentagon. The students who had tuition scholarships, most of them do, were being funded by the Pentagon. And but as we looked closely, there was no military work going on campus, with one exception: the political science department. That was the one place where there was classified work going on. They actually had, this was during the Vietnam War, and they had, the political science department had what was called a Peace Research Institute. That tells you everything. They had villas in Saigon where students were going to work on counterinsurgency under the rubric of peace research. They had secret seminars on counterinsurgency and so on. But that was the only place where there was any war-related work going on campus. And that tells you something about the Pentagon, which people often don't understand. Part of the Pentagon system is, controlling the world by force. But there's another part, and that is sustaining the advanced economy. In the United States, as in other industrial countries, there's a lot of talk about free markets and entrepreneurial initiative and how wonderful they all are. But the people who care about the economy know perfectly well that it's substantially subsidized by the public. And that's particularly true of the high-tech economy. So if you use a computer or the internet or satellites or anything with microelectronics and so on, a lot of that was being developed in the 1950s and the early 60s under Pentagon funding. The reason is that the Pentagon is a very natural funnel for a taxpayer to gouge the taxpayer. If you have programs in the, say, National Institute of Health, Congress feels that they have a responsibility to look at them to see if money is being wasted. But if it's in the Pentagon, they don't look at it. We got to defend ourselves from the Russians or the terrorists or whoever, the aliens, whoever's next. So that's free. And that's exploited to provide the basis for the advanced industrial system and plenty of other things. So, for example, in the 1950s, there was a major development of interstate highways. That's now highly praised as a constructive government stimulus. Technically it was called the National Defense Interstate System. Defense, because you have to stick defense into anything to get it funded. And it even had a pretext. They were going to use it to move intercontinental missiles around the country. Why we had to do that, you can But that program was part of a major state effort at social engineering, huge effort, which suburbanized the country, drove the society towards wasteful use of fossil fuels against undermined efficient transportation like rail system. As you may know, the United States has one of the most backward rail systems in the world, but has plenty of great highways and airports and so on. Well, it was parts of it were under the Pentagon system. That's true of everything else. We flew here, of course, across the ocean. If you take a commercial flight, you're pretty much flying a modified bomber. A lot of the research is done through the Air Force, so the complicated avionics, the metallurgy and all that kind of stuff, and it's kind of adapted to commercial production. So in effect, the Pentagon system is a way to use public funds to increase corporate profits. This is the kind of the funnel through which this is done. And one can certainly criticize that, and should, but it's not military related. It has to do with the way the economy is designed so that the poor subsidize the rich. There are many such ways, and this is one of them. Of course, these things were never put to democratic decision. So, for example, in the 1950s, nobody asked the public, do you want your taxes to go to a system where maybe your grandchildren will have an iPod? Or do you want your taxes to go to building decent communities, providing for health, for education, for the environment, and so on? Those questions are never asked. It's much too dangerous to ask questions like that. This is one of the many ways in which democracy has to be avoided. So it's a real issue, plenty of real issues, but they're not the military ones. Can't hear.
I'm sorry, we can't hear the question up here. Does somebody have a mic down there?
I'm sorry, we can't hear.
We can't hear you, sorry. Yes, of course.
I'm sorry to say that we were from Professor Chomsky, but I felt like is a control mechanism on getting the question. The questions look like something. So, can I raise my question, please?
Yes, please do.
Thank you. Actually, we had an exclusive interview with you 19 years ago, and I had an interview here too, but my question, you said something about fear of democracy. Do you think that there are conspiracy theories enacted against the Egyptian revolution? And do you think that the traps are well designed, or they will be something like on-people, the words that you mentioned about Orwellian linguistics, when you say on-people? Is there a process of on-people in here? Thank you, sir. And then back to you.
I didn't hear, I'm sorry.
Yeah, would somebody just hand this microphone to this man for a moment, please?
I don't want to evade the question, but I can't hear it. Yeah.
No, but everybody should.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe he can come up and take a mic. Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much for giving me the floor. Now I can say you are welcome back to Egypt. We had an exclusive interview with you 19 years ago. I'd like to give you a copy of that interview. And my question is, you mentioned something about fear of democracy. Do you think that there are conspiracy theories enacted and practiced against the Egyptian revolutions, whether inside or outside? And do you think that the vitality of the Egyptian people have stood firm against that, or the traps are so well designed? Is there something like you mentioned about Orwellian linguistics when you mentioned the word "un-people"? Do you think there is a process of suppressing the Egyptian people will to continue its revolution? Thank you, sir.
Conspiracies, either inside or outside. people, in a sense, are being manipulated.
Is there a conspiracy inside or outside to ensure that the unpeople are suppressed? Well, it depends what you mean by a conspiracy. I mean, if you think that, say, General Motors, the car producer, the board of managers gets together and makes plans as to how to make profit, is that a conspiracy? I mean, it's true that groups of people, that those in powerful positions get together and make plans. Okay, that's what they do. And they make the plans in their own interest, typically. That's the point of the failure by design that I quoted. I think if we call those things conspiracies, we're just depriving the word of any meaning. That's just planning. It's rational planning. So is there rational planning, say, by the Western powers with regard to the Arab Spring? Yeah. I mean, we don't have internal documents, so you have to kind of speculate. But in the light of history and in the light of what you see, you can make a pretty plausible speculation. The great fear is losing control of the region and its resources. If there's popular democracy, that's very likely to happen. Just take a look at public opinion. As I say, the Western planners know a lot about public opinion here. That's why they take extensive polls. And public opinion on major issues is the way I described. Do Western planners want policy to reflect those opinions? Do they want policy in Egypt to reflect the view that the main threats that the world faces are Israel and the United States, and that Iran, whether you like it or not, is not much of a threat, and that maybe it would even be better for Iran to have nuclear weapons to offset U.S. power? Do they want, take, say, the 1979 so-called peace treaty, the Egyptian-Israel peace treaty? Public opinion, I haven't seen a poll, but you tell me if I'm wrong. I think public opinion here is not opposed to a peace treaty, but is very opposed to the way the United States and Israel are violating the treaty. You take a look at that treaty. President Carter's here now, so you can ask him, or in Jerusalem or somewhere, so you can ask him. The treaty, or you can read it. The treaty calls for Palestinian autonomy, okay? The treaty does not call for Egypt to be removed from the confrontation so that Israel is then free to attack its northern neighbor, as it did it once and has done repeatedly since, and to expand settlement in the occupied territories, as it did it once. That's the way that the U.S. and Israel have interpreted the treaty. The treaty doesn't say that. And I assume that Egyptian public opinion is opposed to that interpretation of the treaty. Well, do the United States and its allies want that position to become policy? No. And we can go down the line. I presume that I haven't seen a poll again, that the Egyptian public is not at all delighted with the neoliberal policies that have sharply raised the poverty rate, increased concentration of wealth, destroyed benefit such as they are in public services, and would rather see different policies. Well, you know, the banks and the investors and the governments that that carry forward their interests, they don't want those policies to be implemented any more than they do in the United States. So therefore, there's a threat of democracy. But I don't think these things are conspiracies. They're just rational planning, perfectly rational planning. And they're very systematic, they make good sense, and I think we just obscure the picture if we interpret them as some kind of hidden conspiracies. They're mostly pretty open. I mean, the United States, for example, is quite an open society. You have tremendous access to internal planning documents. You know an awful lot about what planners are thinking. The public doesn't know, because this stuff is all kind of sequestered in scholarly studies and so on, where you have to kind of dig it out, or in documents that it's hard. It takes some work to find them, but it's there. And when you look at them, you see fairly systematic, rational planning, like the grand area planning that I mentioned. It's been public since the 1940s. I mean, what happened at the end of when the Russians collapsed in 1989, the US government policies that I mentioned were completely public, okay? But the public doesn't know about them. Scholarship doesn't discuss them. The media, of course, doesn't discuss them. You can find them without much effort, and they're perfectly understandable programs. But there was no conspiracy, and I think the same is true here.
Professor Chomsky has given us a great deal of his time, which is enormously valuable, as we all know, and he's been incredibly generous. Unfortunately, he has to go right at this moment, and that's going to be the last question. I'm going to give him a present on stage here from AUC, and I suspect you would like to join with me in thanking him for the richness of his presentation. Thank you, Professor Chomsky.
واحدة